Video games are the best art form. Bold statement, I know, but I can explain it. If we compare video games to movies, music, paintings, books, whatever, I feel that video games have the most potential to tell a story and to impact their audience emotionally. You might immediately have scoffed at the statement for a variety of reasons. Maybe you think it's ridiculous to call video games an art form at all, but just hear me out for a minute. Because there's something that video games have that no other art form has. It's something that video games have up their sleeve that no other art form can match up to. Video games are interactive. Every other art form has the audience member as a passive observer to the art. You don't interact with paintings or sculptures in museums, you just look at them. You don't interact with the movie at the cinema, you just watch the movie. But with a video game, you are part of the experience. You make choices that change what happens in your playthrough of that game. And a video game can use this to their advantage, to have adaptive stories or to make the player able to permanently affect the world around them. This is an incredible tool at the disposal of video game developers. They have so many more options in order to tell a story than movies, for example, do, because there's an extra layer of depth baked into the art form itself via the interactivity. Now, there's something important to note here. Interactivity of an art form isn't really binary. It's not as simple as this form is interactive and this form is not. There is a blurred line between what is interactive and what isn't interactive. Music, for example, really blurs the line of how we define interactivity, because music can, in some circumstances, be interactive. When you go to a concert and the guy on stage tells you to clap along to the song or sing along to the song, you clapping along is you interacting with that art form. They are the artists creating the art, you are an audience member clapping along to the art, interacting with it. Interaction with music in this manner is extremely simple, and it clearly doesn't compare with something like literally controlling a character in a story. But you could even argue that playing music is interactive. You could argue that these guys on stage are interacting with the music just as much as the guys in the audience are interacting with it. But I'm not sure I quite buy that. When an artist paints a painting, they are interacting with their art, but you wouldn't call paintings an interactive art form, would you? I think that the artist creating the art form has to interact with their art in every single example of an art form. Therefore, that doesn't count as interaction. What we're interested in is whether the audience interacts with the art form, not whether the artist interacts with the art form. These are the artists, this is the audience. Within a video game, there's no disputing that the audience are the ones interacting with the game. When I say video games are interactive, I don't mean this guy or this guy, do I? I mean we, the audience, are interacting with the video game. And we're interacting with it in a far more in-depth way than clapping along at a rock concert could possibly match. Video games aren't like listening to music and clapping along. It's like if you watched Die Hard, but you got to play as Bruce Willis for the entire movie, and you personally drop Alan Rickman off the side of that building at the end of the movie. Video games put you inside of the story, and when it's done well, it really does feel like you're in this character's position the entire time. A good movie or a book can really put you in the character's shoes, but it's nothing compared to literally controlling the character in question from your sofa at home. Video games make you feel like you moulded the story by your own decisions. However, there is a caveat to this. I think that video games have the most potential to tell stories and impact their audience emotionally. I think that as an art form, video games have the best tool set for doing these things, but in practice, I don't think that video games have reached their full potential yet. Video games, in theory, could have vast, expansive stories that branches based out on what decisions the player makes, small or large. But in practice, games tend to either have very linear stories that just take you from point A to point B, or they have lots and lots of options that give you the illusion of choice, but none of those choices actually change much. Remember those Telltale games that came out? They were such a waste of potential. Games like those could be incredible, but the moment the player realizes that their choices don't actually matter, then the magic dies and the story you're experiencing doesn't feel exciting anymore. The developer wants you to feel like your choices matter, but the moment the player realizes that that's a lie, they just turn their brain off. In a perfect world, developers could spend an infinite amount of time and an infinite amount of money on a project to make these giant expansive stories that change with the tiniest decision made by the player. But restrictions with budget and restrictions with deadlines cause even the giant mega budget AAA titles to have to cut content and have to build their story linearly. Of course, many of these games that come out are incredible, but they could be so much more with dynamic stories. Video game developers need to start using gameplay to tell their stories, not just cutscenes, because a cutscene can't do anything that a movie can't do better. Developers need to use the interactivity of their art form to their advantage to have the player actually experience a video game story, not just watch it in all of the cutscenes. Undertale is a game with a fairly expansive story that allows you to make choices that impact the story ahead of you, and it tells this story via gameplay, not just cutscenes. But a game like this struggles to reach a mainstream audience because of the art style. Sure, I think the art style looks great, but try convincing Grandma that this is something she should spend her time doing. It's not going to work, is it? Compare this to God of War. Incredible visuals throughout the entire game, insane sound design, the world instantly immerses you in it, but the story is linear a lot of the time, and the storytelling is done via cutscenes or just expositional dialogue where there's no gameplay, instead of being actually intertwined with the things the character does. There's of course nothing wrong with linear stories, but the one thing that video games have over movies is interactivity, so those things should be used to help tell the story. Don't just cut away to the cutscene when you want to have a deep character moment. Have the player play the deep character moment somehow. Figure out some new and inventive way to have the player experience it in gameplay. Of course, in reality, the question of which art form is the best art form is completely unanswerable. It's just my opinion, but I do think there's a very interesting discussion to be had here about what video games are capable of, because I really don't think that video games have reached their full potential for storytelling yet. There's so much more to explore and so many new and interesting ways to tell a story that the player is actually in control of. There are some games out there that give you the illusion of choice already, but in reality those games don't actually give you as much agency as the player thinks they have. And don't get me wrong, I don't think that a game is bad just because it has a linear story or a simple story, or even no story at all. But I think that video games have the potential to tell complex stories in a completely new way that movies, books, or theatre couldn't possibly match. Video games are much, much newer than all of these other art forms. Whereas poetry and painting and books have all had up to thousands of years to figure out what they're good at and what their limitations are, video games are comparatively very novel. They're seen as a bit of a time sink or a gimmick to lots of the older generations. In fact, calling them an art form would be seen as a joke to them. But one day, a video game will come out that will tell an incredible story, and that story will be told using its interactivity to its advantage. And hopefully that'll be Half-Life 3.